Back in the 15th century, Seville in Spain looked absolutely glorious. The bright sun shone down on the red-tiled rooftops every single day, the streets were bustling with life, and the whole city was filled with warm, everyday vibes. To outsiders, it seemed like a perfect place to live a peaceful and comfortable life. But none of that warmth and happiness ever reached a family living on the edge of the city. They dwelled in the forgotten corners of town, forever hidden from the light, trapped in a life of depression and misery. They were never born evil, and deep down they had the same kindness and conscience as everyone else. Yet from the day they were born, they were chained tight by the city's cruel rules, the hypocritical religious doctrines, and the darkest sides of human nature, with no way to break free. This was the family everyone in Seville feared, despised, yet couldn't live without. A bloodline of executioners, generation after generation. Chains of the heart, shunned by the whole world since childhood. The protagonist never had a real childhood to speak of. While other kids ran around playing and hanging out together, he grew up all alone, learning early on just how cold and prejudiced people could be. As soon as he was old enough to remember things, his mother gave him a simple little wooden stick. It looked worthless and plain, but it became a lifelong rule for him, an invisible wall cutting him off from the lively world outside, dooming him to never live a normal life. As a little kid, he was confused. He didn't know why he couldn't run and play freely like other children, or why everyone in the market fled from his mother the second they saw her, their faces filled with fear and hatred, treating her like a bad omen. He kept all these questions to himself until he turned 8, when reality hit him hard, crushing all his childish hopes and leaving him with nothing but despair. He was just an innocent kid who wanted friends and to fit in. He plucked up his courage and tried to join the other children to play, but those kids had already been poisoned by adults' prejudice. They saw him as a bringer of bad luck, shouted insults, and labeled him a jinx. They threw stones at him again and again, leaving him covered in cuts and blood. In that painful moment, he finally understood. The so-called family curse was never some mysterious fate. It was the screams of people his father had executed, the unerasable sin carved into his bones by the identity of an executioner. While the whole town slept, the basement stayed dark, damp, and sunless, reeking of blood and rot that made anyone gag the second they breathed it in. From that moment on, all the goodness in his life vanished, leaving only endless bloodshed and darkness. There was no real justice or fair trial down here. It was just a place to torture people under the disguise of religion and law. The strappado ripped shoulders out of their sockets, bringing unbearable agony. The toca water torture made victims feel like they were drowning over and over again, a living nightmare worse than death. The potro torture rack pushed human bones to their breaking point, slowly destroying people's bodies and minds. The torture tools were cold and cruel, the torture routines repetitive and ruthless. No one cared if the accused was innocent, they only followed the brutal process. Down in that basement, violence wasn't just losing your temper and lashing out. It was a craft to be learned, practiced, and passed down the family line, a brutal way to make a living. Standing beside the torture devices, with a cold, emotionless face, his father spoke a heartless sentence to the terrified boy. "They fear us because they need us." Those words were the cruel, harsh truth of that era. The city needed executioners to do the dirty work, to bear the blood and the blame, and keep up the fake appearance of order and religious piety. Yet the townsfolk all looked down on executioners, refusing to get their own hands dirty or take any responsibility. At first, the protagonist threw up and trembled every time he took part in an execution, forcing himself to get used to the blood and numb his heart. One day, he watched a victim scream and suffer without shaking, without feeling sorry for them at all. He knew right then he'd lost his humanity, turning into nothing more than a cold, heartless execution machine. The loop of fate, an inescapable destiny for generations. When his father died, he took over the torture tools and the bloody, hated job that made him a social outcast for life. After years on the job, he learned to put on a cold mask, numbing himself to cope with a society that forced him to do evil, then judged him for it. He still tried to live a normal life, getting married and having a child, hoping the warmth of family life could comfort his broken heart. He kept lying to himself, separating his cruel job from his daily life, telling himself he wasn't a bad person as long as he just followed the rules at work. He thought he and his son could escape the family curse, but fate was an endless loop, etched into his blood. There was no running away. Years later, his 15-year-old son, just as kind and innocent as he once was, stood up to defend his mother from insult and harm. For that simple act, the boy was arrested and strapped to the torture rack. Standing at the execution stand he knew all too well, he watched his own flesh and blood struggling in agony. A chilling, familiar terror washed over him, breaking his heart completely. Beside him, the cold inquisitor kept pushing him to execute the torture, caring only about following the rules, not caring the victim was his own son. In that moment, all his lies, hopes, and denial shattered into pieces. The story has no fierce fights or brutal, bloody scenes, yet the oppressive weight of it is suffocating. The shadow watching over their family wasn't just one evil person, it was the tyranny of the Inquisition, a rotten system that used God's name to satisfy its own greed, a bottomless abyss that devoured all humanity and conscience. Generation after generation, whether they worked to survive, feed their families, or commit so-called necessary evils, none could escape the little wooden stick that symbolized rules and death, or the family curse of violence passed down for decades. The most heartbreaking part of this story is not how cruel the torture was, but how this evil was doomed to repeat forever, with no one able to break the cycle of fate. When his son opened his eyes weakly on the torture rack and looked up at his executioner, he didn't just see his loving father, he saw another man exactly like all his ancestors, cold on the surface, tears in his eyes, torn inside, yet forced to inflict pain. A father forced to torture his own son, trapped in an endless cycle of destiny. They never wanted to be evil, yet they were forced to do terrible things their whole lives. Betrayed by a hypocritical, selfish city and a cruel system, they were locked in a bloody abyss forever, generation after generation, with no hope of escape.